Echoes of Austen. To quote a text is to act within culture and politics. Quotation picks up meaning from one location and projects it into another, where it does new and different work. As it does so, it makes certain kinds of cultural activity possible. Alan Munton. Hi! I want to talk about JAFF, or Jane Austen fanfiction. Specifically, I want to sketch out some preliminary thoughts and hypotheses about one particular aspect of JAFF, and that is the fact that its authors use quotations from source material, that is Jane Austen's works, much more frequently than in any other fandom I've ever read fic in. It's so frequent and it's so often commented on by fic readers that it almost starts to seem systematic. So what's going on here, and what might it tell us about fan fiction from both a literary and a social point of view to try to figure that out? Firstly, I want to briefly talk about some of the ideas and practices around quotation that would have been current in Jane Austen's time and how she responded to them in her novels. And then I want to turn to talking about how JAFF writers either respond to these ideas and practices or create their own. How is quotation used in JAFF and why? 18th century extract culture. Quotation is a good thing. There is a community of mind in it. Classical quotation is the parole of literary men all over the world. Samuel Johnson. So how does quotation work in 18th century England? Well, at this point in time, there's been a culture of quotation for a couple centuries already, but it tended to favor the learning and circulation of classical quotations, which is to say quotations from Latin and Greek. The literature of vernacular European languages, such as French, Spanish, and Italian, became more widespread as a source of quotation towards the mid to late 18th century. And then during the same time or shortly afterwards, we begin to see English literature as well, such as the works of Shakespeare, Milton, and Pope, begin to be considered acceptably learned to the degree that it's worth excerpting something from them. So we're pulling quotes from various literary, religious, philosophical texts. What are we doing with them? Well, schools at this time were really big on memorization and recitation as modes of engaging with literature. So an educated person was expected to have a storehouse of quotations and allusions ready in their mind. These quotations might then be used in conversation or in writing. If you were an author or a clergyman trying to write a sermon, you might look for a quotation that would suit a certain situation, either to lend authority to your words or to provide a bit of poetic ornament or to give your writing an educated air. Over these centuries, we see the publication of a lot of collections of quotations or aphorisms or adages. As I said, they were largely Latin and Greek in the 16th and 17th centuries and increasingly vernacular as the 18th century wore on. And these reference works tended to be organized by topic, so you might get headings like love, anger, forgiveness, etc. So people could use these as memory aids to help them confirm a quotation or as an aid to find a relevant quotation to use in whatever they were writing. These might also be used as practice for the art of reading well aloud. In particular, novels in the mid to late 18th century are full of quotations. In the mid 18th century, these would tend to be delivered by the characters themselves, either in their dialogue or in letters that they had written. Kate Rumble describes mid-18th century quotations as formal and frequent. Formal meaning that there's a form, there's an expected pattern to it. It's become very standardized. In terms of text, the source text or the author is usually mentioned, and often there's some reflection on why the quote is appropriate in the context. In terms of formatting, the quote will be set on a new line and indented so that it's surrounded by white space. For example, this passage from Samuel Richardson's The History of Sir Charles Grandison shows Clementina being described as, in English, breaking out into that line of Hamlet, which she had taken great notice of when we read that play together. Angels and ministers of grace, defend us. And then the narration continues after the quote. We can see in these two examples as well that this text italicizes the quotations as well as setting them off from the rest of the text. By the late 18th century, quotations more frequently occur in third-person narration, both in epigraphs at the beginning of the chapter and throughout a text as though they were being used by the narrator. In these examples from Anne Radcliffe's Romance of the Forest, we can see similar formatting with that surrounding white space. as well as some shorter quotations that are in line with the rest of the text. In that last example, the innocent heroine Adeline is dealing with suspicion from her only friend, Madame Lamotte, who thinks that she's having an affair with her husband. So Madame Lamotte is being very cold to Adeline, and she has no idea why. The narrator describes Madame Lamotte's attitude thusly. The behavior of Adeline in the late scene she considered as a refined piece of art, and the indifference of Lamotte as affected. So true is it that trifles light as air are to the jealous confirmation strong as proof of holy writ, and so ingenious was she to twist the true cause the wrong way. The first quotation is from Othello, which is of course also about false suspicion of infidelity. The second quote, as far as I can figure out, is a misquote from Henry VI, Part 2. Chief Justice accuses Falstaff of wrenching the true cause the false way. From the misquote, we can probably assume that Radcliffe was writing this from memory. It's fine, we're chill. This formalized format leads the reader to understand that the language is borrowed, it's imported from somewhere and someone else. The original author of the quotation may be named or they may not. In the latter case, the reader is just welcome to connect the quotation to its source from their own memory, if they can, perhaps to use a reference work. Of course, the fact that the use of this type of quotation, both in writing and speech, is associated with literary and educated culture leads to the association of quotation with being pretentious, or with being an attempt to sound more learned than your company, whether or not you actually have the learning to back it up. The author of A Dictionary of Quotations in Various Languages, which was published in 1797, mentions quotations as something with which those who know but little affect to impose on those who have learned something less. Other criticism of quotation and extract culture comes from its association with the deficiencies of women's education in 18th and 19th century England. Young women would often write down notable quotations or passages, aka extracts, in their personal commonplace books, and these quotations may come from their own reading, but they may have been encountered in an anthology. Critics of feminine education felt that this type of quotation was a very shallow type of interaction with a text. It didn't necessarily involve actually understanding or thinking with or applying anything that you read. Hannah More was one prominent critic who called quotation anthologies brief and disconnected patches of broken and discordant materials, and wrote that reading them was an infallible receipt for making a superficial mind. Ouch. So this environment of decades of frequent quotation, things that have been quoted over and over again in a lot of novels in the same context, and they've become very expected over time, and also a lot of second-order writing and discourse about that culture of quotation. That's the environment in which Austen is writing in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. There's a lot to be said about Austen's responses to that extract culture in general. For example, Henry Crawford flitting through Shakespeare and performing a few speeches, or Mary Bennet taking extracts without seeming to learn anything from what she reads. But I want to limit myself to just a couple examples of explicit quotation that occur in Austen. Austen doesn't actually directly quote very often, certainly not in the way that mid-century novelists had. The most prominent example of quotation is definitely in Northanger Abbey, which was the first of her 6 published novels to be drafted around 1799. And it's actually a satire on the uses of quotation rather than just the application of inappropriate quote. We can see from these pages that Austen uses the common layout of mid-century quotations. She puts quotations on a new indented line surrounded by white space. But here, these quotations are used to poke fun at extract culture as it's reflected in Gothic novels. She introduces the list of quotes by writing that Catherine Morland read all such works as heroines must read to supply their memories with those quotations which are so serviceable and so soothing in the vicissitudes of their eventful lives, and then follows that with a few quotes from Alexander Pope, Thomas Gray, Shakespeare, etc. So we're being told that Catherine is like a Gothic heroine because she is prepared to quote these authors, but more so than that, she's imitating the 18th century Gothic heroines who have already quoted these works. The Shakespeare quotation about jealousy is the same one from Othello that Radcliffe had quoted years earlier. So what Catherine is really learning is which parts of which English literary works other authors tend to quote and the uses that they tend to put them to. Her literary education in that sense is like second and third hand. In Emma, we've got Mrs. Elton as our primary user and abuser of quotations. Her uses of quotation follow the typical pattern of a mid-18th century novel, like that example from Charles Grandison that we looked at. A quotation is invoked by a character in their dialogue, and there is some reflection about how it applies to the current situation. Although Mrs. Elton usually doesn't seem to remember the author, she just says the poet or something. We also see the same kind of thing that we had seen in Northanger Abbey with Mrs. Elton, where there's a little mockery leveled at someone whose education is very quotation heavy. But Bharat Tandon points out that it may go beyond that. In Emma, Austen may have added a new element into the mix, which is closer consideration of where that quotation actually comes from. When Mrs. Elton slightly misquotes Thomas Gray in urging Emma to join her in taking responsibility for Jane Fairfax and says, "Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its fragrance on the desert air." Yes, she's being a little obnoxious, and yes, instead of the original sweetness, she misquotes the more artificial-sounding fragrance. But it may also be relevant that these lines are taken from Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard or graveyard. We know that Jane Fairfax has a tendency towards illness, so these lines' association with death is probably unintended by Mrs. Elton, but it still may be noted by the reader who is able to trace the quotation to its source. Emma Woodhouse's quotations also make the reader work a little bit. Famously, she quotes A Midsummer Night's Dream, "The course of true love never did run smooth." But unlike in other mid-century novels that quote Shakespeare, Emma doesn't take this quote as a maxim or use it to add authority to her own opinion. She actually challenges it. So the reader may be left wondering to what extent she will be proven correct or incorrect. So then, just like in earlier novels, quotation in Austen is there to be evaluated. The narrator, or perhaps other characters in the scene, and especially the reader, are meant to judge how the quotation bears on the situation, compare the original source to its current context, and decide whether it fits, or whether the character is performing or exaggerating, or unable to find the right words, or mistaken. Quotation in JAFF. So how is this environment similar to or different from what we see in JAFF? Well, like in 18th century novels, quotation is frequent. Anecdotally, I've found quotation in JAFF, especially in the Pride and Prejudice and Emma fandoms, to be way more frequent and extensive than in any other fandom I've participated in. Educated quotations from Regency-appropriate sources do appear, like a fic will sometimes quote Shakespeare or Milton, and other characters often discuss these works. But that's not what I want to focus on here. I want to talk about quotations from Jane Austen's original works and consider how modern JAFF writers and readers adapt the culture of quotation that's evidenced in those works, or how they may create their own culture surrounding the usage of quotation. But first, if the listener will indulge me, I have a note on definitions. For the purposes of this talk, when I mention JAFF or fanfiction, I define fanfiction very narrowly. The definition I'm working with is based on 3 criteria. Firstly, fanfiction is based on a source text. Secondly, it arises out of fandom as it exists in the modern age and in the context of modern copyright law. And thirdly, it is thought of as and presented as fanfiction by the people who write and read it, and it's distributed via distribution networks that writers and readers view as largely particular to fanfiction, which here means posting online. This means that I'm not considering JAFF novels that are self-published or published by fan-run presses. But that's not because of a difference in the texts themselves. JAFF novels do use quotation, and the texts themselves are sometimes exactly the same. Like you can find the same fic published online and for sale as a JAFF novel on Amazon or something. But the distinction that I'm drawing is in the context in which the text is encountered, because that does matter as far as how the text is read and received goes. Specifically, websites where fanfic is posted tend to have more scope for things like author's notes. They tend to have mechanisms for interaction like commenting, liking, and reviewing, which novels don't have built in. And the authors of these fics may then respond to those comments in reviews, so the culture that I want to talk about is one that is able to make use of those mechanisms. The second definition is that as regards the word quotation, what I mean is just any string of language that is copied closely enough that the reference to some string of language in an original Austen text is apparent to a reader who remembers that text. Basically an allusion or a reference that is made through copied language. A lot of scholarly work on quotation centers the quotation mark itself. It's not possible here. Most of the quotations I'm talking about don't use quotation marks. They use the reader's memory of a text as the only way of marking something as a reference to the original work. Lastly, I'm going to talk about 4 broad patterns that I've seen with how quotes are used, but these aren't necessarily meant to be discrete categories where every instance of quotation falls into one category or another. They're more like a gradient of different but potentially overlapping modes that quotations can take part in. Okay, let's get into it. Good grief. That is as it happens. It becomes a matter of reconstruction and recontextualization rather than of precise repetition, where the new user of the words is communicating a particular attitude to the words or to their original speaker in this new enactment, manipulating the audience's interpretation. There is necessarily always some element of reformulation in the representation of someone else's words. Ruth Finnegan. I really didn't think this through. My hand's gonna hurt a lot at the end of this. That is as it happens is maybe the most straightforward of these kinds of quotation. It occurs when the author is writing a canon fic, which is to say one where they haven't changed any of the actual events of the novel. Maybe they've written a scene from another character's perspective, but the dialogue and the incidental text describing characters' actions and things remains the same because that's just what's said in that scene. It's just what happens. For example, Chillim's A Portrait of a Perfect Gentleman gives Henry Tilney's point of view of a conversation which in Northanger Abbey had instead been focalized through Catherine Morland. The conversation where they clear up the misunderstanding about Catherine's missing their walk is presented indirectly until a quote from Catherine is reproduced exactly. "But Mr. Tilney, why were you less generous than your sister? If she felt such confidence in my good intentions and could suppose it to be only a mistake, why should you be so ready to take offense?" The fic then continues with more text written by the fic author. The question was posed with such artless air and implied a genuine interest in the answer to it that Henry felt himself distressed all of a sudden, and having no appropriate response, he asked her instead if he could join her, to which she promptly showed him a chair near her. Cases like these, where a character's reflections on the conversation they're having are interspersed with the original dialogue, may present a particular interpretation of the canon material. They may encourage readers to see the source material in a different light. So we can see writing fanfiction as one way of presenting an argument about the original text. For another example, we might look at Guinterres's reading of a scene in Persuasion in their fic Home from the Assizes. In the novel, Mrs. Musgrove compares her anxiety over her husband's travels within England to the anxiety felt by naval wives who, of course, travel much more broadly and in more dangerous circumstances. So we might be inclined to take a comic reading of that scene and think that Mrs. Musgrove is being made fun of a little bit here. But this fic instead forwards an emotional reading of that line that is far more sympathetic to Mrs. Musgrove. Mrs. Musgrove knew how sweet was the air that wafted in from the hills on the heels of a dearly beloved husband, and how precious such air was, since it was never certain. And so it was with complete and utter sincerity that Mrs. Musgrove declared, "Yes, indeed, oh yes, I am quite of your opinion, Mrs. Croft. There is nothing so bad as a separation. I am quite of your opinion," she said earnestly, etc. The Admiral's wife, with the grace of having lived in worlds large and small, reached over and pressed Mrs. Musgrove's hand. Also note the formatting here. The quote is italicized and it's then cited in the author's note. We might think of the 18th century form for including quotations that I described earlier. Along with reflections from a character other than the one whose voice we hear in the novel, something else that's often added to quotations of this type is visual or physical description, which Austen tends to be very sparse with. For example, Jojo 4's The News Must Be Spread Further copies Emma's and Mr. Knightley's conversation toward the end of the novel about whether the Weston's child is going to end up spoiled and whether Mr. Knightley's interference with Emma did harm or good. But they intersperse it with new text about Emma's reflections on the conversation and movement descriptors, such as, in these sentences, "At length he came to join her at the window. She had been away too long, and her soft eyes cast in his direction had beckoned as they conversed." The author reflects on this practice in their author's note, which says, "I lifted a shameful bit of Austen's text for the first part, but subsequent parts will be completely original, nor is this merely a copy. Austen seldom writes motion. The characters, for all you know, are sitting down talking for whole conversations. So I've inserted a bit more movement while still trying to keep true to Austen's voice." I balanced the camera on a cat tree. So what you're hearing right now is my cat scratching. Sweetheart, I know that's yours, but it's not yours right now. It's not yours anymore. Okay. Shh. Sometimes nothing in particular will be added to a particular conversation, and if you happen to have read it a million times in the original novel and in fics that quote it, you do tend to kind of skip over that conversation. I've seen some authors, presumably in order to avoid that effect, actually go out of their way to avoid quotation, and they present dialogue indirectly in summary. What's interesting about that is that we get back to the idea of memory, a reader being invited to make the connection to a text that they remember. To take one example, Buckbeak Baby, in Neither Duty Nor Honor, reduces a good deal of the dialogue that takes place in the Netherfield drawing room to just a discussion on the merits of Bingley's hasty nature, as if just referring to that conversation is enough to bring it up in the reader's mind in full. So, some of the quotations in the That Is As It Happens mode are in this style, where they're interspersed with or smoothly incorporated into the fic author's text. But sometimes, particularly if a text isn't canon all the way through, but it instead diverges from canon at a certain point into a speculative what-if story, you might get a section from the novel quoted as an introduction. That quote might be formatted identically to the rest of the fic so that you can't immediately see where the join is, but it may often be formatted differently, italicized, or cited so that the place where the fic author's text picks up from where Austen's leaves off is very visually obvious. In cases like that, quotation serves as an aid to the memory, to make the reader understand that this is the part of the novel that we're in. Because this is fan fiction, and so some authors assume a baseline level of understanding of the source text, we don't need to introduce characters from the beginning. We can just say, you remember this part of the book, right? We're starting here. For example, Rusako's Playing Their Cards Right opens with a sustained quotation from Pride and Prejudice at the part where Elizabeth is serving coffee and she and Darcy are having a hard time even speaking to each other, much less making their feelings understood. In canon, Darcy then leaves again, and he only comes back once we've had the Lady Catherine confrontation. But in this fic, it goes AU right at the point where that quote cuts off. Rather than staying silent until Darcy moves away again, Elizabeth continues the conversation in a coded way that allows him to find out that her feelings for him have changed. Rose Dessler's Story Within a Story, or Matilda's Woes, completes the faux Gothic tale that Henry had invented for Catherine's amusement in Northanger Abbey. The author's note begins with a quote. It's set off from the rest of the text by formatting. It's italicized and it's also cited. But then in the body of the text, it repeats that line unitalicized and it just completes it with no evidence of a break between Austen's/Henry's text and the fic author's text. "Oh, thou, whomsoever thou mayest be, into whose hands these memoirs of the wretched Matilda may fall, read these writings and pity me. Oh, what shall I do? Here in this chamber there is nothing I can do, no one to help me." And it goes on. Interestingly, that whole fic is also in the format of a quotation. It's quoting Matilda, who wrote the manuscript. Difference of situation. Like parables, but more subtly, quotations could comment indirectly. This demanded creative skill in bringing a quotation to bear on a particular situation and selecting the aspect to emphasize. Ruth Finnegan. So much respect for teachers from the pre-smartboard era. All right. That is as it happens quotations kind of shade into the next mode I identify, which is difference of situation. Difference of situation quoting happens when the quotation in question occurs during a what-if or an alternate universe scenario after something has already gone off the rails from canon. But it's still applied to the same person, and the application of it hasn't radically changed. For example, in HL or Heels, Not Every Gentleman, Elizabeth Bennet has been raised as Edward Bennet until his majority in order to break the entailment that had prevented any female offspring from inheriting Longbourn. After the legal proceedings to break the entailment have been completed, he becomes or re-becomes Elizabeth, who is unsure how to behave as a lady, or unsure how she would have behaved had she always been raised as a woman. She reflects, "Her father had often said when she had been merely a child that her courage rose with every attempt to intimidate her. She hoped that it was enough to remind herself that what was considered charming in a young gentleman could certainly be unbecoming in a young lady." This, of course, recalls what Elizabeth says to Darcy while playing the pianoforte at Rosings. "There is a stubbornness about me that never can bear to be frightened at the will of others. My courage always rises with every attempt to intimidate me." The reattributed quotation serves to jog our memory of what happens in canon and to make us alive to that sense of dramatic irony that's really common in AU fanfics. That joke where the characters will wonder about what would have happened if so-and-so had occurred, and unbeknownst to them, that's what had occurred in canon. Or a character says, "Oh, I would never do that," and you know that they would and that they did. The characters don't know what happened in the source text, but many of the people reading do. In this case, a quotation reminds us that we actually do know what Edward would be like if he had been raised Elizabeth, and that some people at least do consider her manners very charming in a young lady. The allusion shows us how similar the fix Elizabeth actually is to canon Elizabeth, that canonically she's not quite as timid or as demure as Edward thinks that perhaps ladies are supposed to be. So the quotation makes us aware of that similarity. But by the same move, it also makes us aware of the differences in the fic author's scenario from canon. Elizabeth in this AU is probably not confident enough yet about how she ought to behave as a lady to say anything like this about herself at this point in time. This kind of quotation could make the reader think about a lot of things, but for me, it inspired reflection about Elizabeth's characterization and her home life, and how interesting it is that she is so self-assured. Sometimes a fic will keep the same dialogue but change the circumstances or the relationship of the characters uttering it so that the tone of it reads differently. This happens a lot in Pride and Prejudice fics, where a really common variation is that Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy are friends from the beginning, or almost the beginning of their acquaintance. So we can understand Elizabeth's dialogue the way that Mr. Darcy mistakenly understood it in canon, as being, lightly teasing rather than criticizing and trying to offend him. For example, in Elizabeth's Such Terms of Cordiality, we get this interpretation of the dialogue at Lucas Lodge. Much as it pained her to agree with Miss Bingley, she had to admit that her report of Mr. Darcy as never talking much among company, but perfectly agreeable among intimate acquaintance, seemed essentially correct. For a man of such pride, this deficiency of nature must be all the more irksome. To those who felt themselves his inferior, it might give the impression of him being disagreeable and ill-natured. But Elizabeth did him justice, and pitying him, did her best to draw him out. One evening at Sir William Lucas's, she began by turning to him and saying archly, "Did not you think, Mr. Darcy, that I expressed myself uncommonly well just now when I was teasing Colonel Forster to give us a ball at Meryton?" "With great energy, but it is a subject which always makes a lady energetic," he said, smiling a little in response. She was pleased, without caring to meditate too deeply on the cause for it. "You were severe on us." So we get the exact same dialogue here, but the tone of it is much more friendly, where in the original she is instead provoked by his hovering and means to be impertinent. So we can see how while a lot of fics are perfectly comprehensible on their own without knowledge of the source material, identifying a reference can still open up a whole other set of associations and reflections. And these associations don't owe their life to the original novel or to the fanfic alone, but they result from the original novel and the fanfic collaborating to produce that effect. And that way, we can compare this to the expected reader response to an 18th century culture of literary quotation, because the reader is meant to evaluate the appropriateness of a quotation to the situation in which it's represented. The difference, of course, is that what's being compared are two alternate versions of the same story, or different possible pathways arising from the same set of events. There's the same education that a reader is educated in a certain way, but here it basically means having read the source text or perhaps other Austen works. And what's emphasized is not so much a canonical education where you should have read Shakespeare and Milton and Pope and Gray, but the sense of plurality and repetition and variation that characterizes so much of fan fiction. But what happens if we go a little bit further afield and we actually reassign text to different characters and situations entirely? So material a change. Used in this way, quotation is creative. The possibility of the misuse of migrated texts is always present and is called either misquotation or quoting out of context. Falsified migrations can cause excitement and tension for skeptical readers. Alan Munton. The next mode of quotation that I identify is one that I like to call so material a change. I consider a quotation to be in this mode if the context is changed substantially from what occurs in canon. One person's thought becomes another person's dialogue, dialogue about one character becomes dialogue about another character, etc. And that shift in context implies a parallel, a comparison, or perhaps a contrast being drawn between two things. So again, fan fiction can serve as an argument about the original. This type of quotation appears a lot in Emma fan fiction, especially in order to suggest parody or parallelism between Emma and Mr. Knightley. The argument here, I think, is one that literary scholars have about Emma all the time, which is to do with the extent to which Knightley's knowledge and authority are godlike, versus to what extent he's just a person who's prone to the same emotional reactions and errors of judgment that Emma and everyone else in the novel are. So this usage of quotation would tend to humanize him. For example, the Emma sequel Blessings by I.M. BBQ opens a chapter by talking about how George Knightley, handsome, sensible, and rich, with a very comfortable home and a beautiful family, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence and had lived nearly 42 years in the world with very little to distress or vex him. One reader response shows that this use of allusion is understood as highlighting a parallel that exists in the original text, and that it actually changed their perspective on the novel. That comment reads, "Love how your introduction of George Knightley parallels canon, and I've never actually thought about how fitting it is. Yes, of course Mr. Knightley was attractive, wealthy, and had very little to vex him also. Well done for picking up on that and weaving it into your story." Susan C's Mr. Knightley's side of the story gives us, well, Mr. Knightley's side of when he went to London believing that Emma was in love with Frank Churchill. As soon as he considers that it is possible that they might marry, it darted through him with the speed of an arrow that Emma must marry no one but himself, which is of course exactly what Emma thinks about Knightley at that same point in the novel, but with the pronouns changed. The author writes that the quotation is used to emphasize a similarity of experience. I use actual wording from Jane Austen's Emma here throughout the story. I am not in any way attempting to plagiarize. It's all in fun to support my supposition that both Emma and Mr. Knightley were going through hell. This, by the way, is part of why fan fiction is such a joy to study, because you've got a large body of writers and readers who are expressing themselves very self-consciously about how they write and read and why they do things and interpret things the way that they do. Anyway, sometimes a change in the character being referenced can signal a large change from canon. In Living in Dreamland story A Sensible Girl, a clever Harriet is pretending to friendship with Emma while she actually dislikes her for being arrogant and interfering. As they're discussing Robert Martin's offer of marriage, Emma gives her, "I wonder how the young man could have the assurance to ask it. He must have a pretty good opinion of himself," line. And then Harriet responds exactly as she does in canon. "I must confess that since my visiting here I have seen people, and if one comes to compare them, person and manners, there is no comparison at all. One is so very handsome and agreeable." Of course, she's talking about Mr. Elton's person, which is to say his appearance, and manners as compared to Robert Martin's, with the understanding that Mr. Elton is the superior. But in the fic, this same sentence has the reverse meaning. Harriet follows it up by thinking, "Indeed, there can be no comparison. My Robert is the best of men." So the implication is that Robert's manners are superior to Mr. Elton's, or perhaps even to Emma's. By repeating the same sentence, the author in fact emphasizes a difference between Austen's interpretation of Harriet and the fic's presentation of her. There's also, by the way, a reversal implied in the title, A Sensible Girl, which is an abridged quote from Mr. Knightley, who had said to Emma she is not a sensible girl, nor a girl of any information. Lucy Q's fic A Literary Courtship also uses quotation to signal a reversal from canon. Specifically, the story reverses Darcy's thoughts towards the end of Elizabeth's stay at Netherfield when Jane was ill. In the novel, he determines to ignore her so as not to raise her expectations, but in the fic, it is his expectations that are disappointed. Whatever thoughts he had that her previous attentions had been directed to influencing his felicity, her behavior of the last few hours provided very material weight in crushing them. There he sat, not 6 feet from her, pretending to read his own book, and she had not paid him the slightest heed despite his multiple attempts to catch her eye. Poor Darcy. Another reversal. In Becca's Of Time Gone By, Darcy is given thoughts that closely parallel Elizabeth's thoughts after she learns the truth about Wickham and realizes that she has misjudged him and Darcy. How despicably have I acted, I who have prided myself on independence, I who have valued myself on my cleverness, who have often disdained the generous candor of my sister's assistants, and gratified my vanity by supposing myself above my neighbors in understanding and ability, even as they judged me lacking. Comparisons may also take place between different novels. Freakishly Geekily Me's A Parallel History writes that Emma, after the Box Hill debacle, loathes herself, what she has allowed, even encouraged herself to become. This is perhaps an echo of Mr. Darcy's telling Elizabeth that his parents had allowed, encouraged, almost taught me to be selfish and overbearing, to care for none beyond my own family circle, which would point out certain similarities between Emma and Mr. Darcy that Jane Austen scholars point to as well. But what if we look at some examples that can't really be attributed to any of these modes? I'll tell you what. A game of alphabets. Here is a man who steals and boasts of his thefts and deliberately leaves clues to guide his pursuers to their prey. He says, "Here is a theft from Homer. Track it down, and none will rejoice more than I when it is found." He gives added pleasure to his hearers by stirring their memories in this fashion, by making them recognize the old in the new. E. Kellett. So when a quotation is applied to a different person, novel, or situation, is it always intended to function as an argument, highlighting a comparison, parallel, or contrast between those people or situations? For example, in Glacier White's I'm Not Well Enough, Mr. Knightley has been keeping to his bed after having been injured. The doctor tells him that he ought to start to try to walk again, but when he gets tired, Emma says, "Maybe you should try step by step. Do not commit yourself." Which is, of course, a reference to what Emma says when she's discouraging him from speaking to her about his love for Harriet. So is the experience of trying to walk again too quickly after being injured being compared to making a declaration of love? Or when Liberty Roll has the unwanted suitor of a female original character in their Northanger Abbey fic Enthusiasm tell that original character during a dance that he felt the need for conversation, as it would look odd to be entirely silent for half an hour together, as Elizabeth had told Darcy. Is Elizabeth being cast in the role of unwanted suitor to Darcy? Or is it being suggested that the suitor is trying to nettle his partner in the way that Elizabeth was criticizing Darcy for being silent? I don't really think so. I don't think that it makes much sense to read these quotes in that way. And there are a lot of quotations like this where I can't find any reading where it's productive to set the original source of the allusion against its current setting. Robert Folkenflik says that in contrast to other 18th century poets who use quotation ironically or as a form of competition, in some poets, borrowing may be a neutral activity, a craftsmanly taking over of accessible material. E. Kellett writes of quotation and allusion as the prudent and economical use of materials provided by others. I think that those are good ways of explaining what's going on with examples like these. The language is being used because it's there. Austen's works are treated like a storehouse of available language that can be pulled out and assigned and reassigned and changed at will. Given that people in Austen fandom tend to really prize an Austen-esque tone, commenters frequently praise writers for having written something that sounds like Austen could have written it. Well, I mean, what could be more true to Austen's tone, syntax, and vocabulary than Austen's vocabulary? In the author's note to Pterodactyls Trying to Tread Water, they write, "Obligatory notice that there are scattered paragraphs taken basically word for word from the book. I operate under the assumption that no one can say it better than Jane Austen." So we use this language because it's economical. For another reason, I think that this and other types of quotation can also serve to prolong the experience of reading the original novel for the fanfic reader. And often that's why people search out fanfiction, right? They want more of the work in question. For example, in the author's note to Relkana's A Conversation at Dawn, which is an alternate or expanded Pride and Prejudice second proposal scene, they write, "I have used more of the novel's direct language in the story than I normally do. If you recognize it, it's most likely hers." And then someone leaving a comment on the fic wrote that it felt as if I was reading a chapter right out of the book. And side note, that if you recognize it, it's most likely hers gets back to the understanding of an author knowing what a reader is likely to remember or recognize. So that feeling of having more of a book can be provided by the experience of recognition caused by reading a line that you remember, or even the subconscious slight titillation of the memory, as Kellett says, that may be caused by the use of similar wording even if the reader doesn't consciously make the connection. I also want to note that fan fiction itself has an iterative element to it, an element of things being repeated, rearranged, repeated again, changed. Tropes are self-consciously applied and tweaked and reversed or applied differently. And in fanfic communities, there's an understanding that nothing is final. One interpretation of a scene doesn't prevent the existence of another interpretation by another author or even by the same author at a different time. So the repetition and use and reuse of language, the idea that a sentence existing in one context to mean one thing does not prevent its existing in a different context to mean something else, it makes a lot of sense in that fandom context. And I'll tell you what I mean when I reference the implied repetition of language even within a particular fic. I would say that one of the most commonly used quotations in Pride and Prejudice fic is the "petticoat 6 inches deep in mud" line. And it's often used the same way. Elizabeth says it flirtatiously to Darcy after they're engaged. So that's kind of an interesting parallel to that situation in the 18th century where you had some quotes that became tropes in themselves from being used in the same context by so many different novelists. To take one example, there are so many, but to take one, in Lady Spencer's Pride and Prejudice sequel, St. Agnes Eve, Elizabeth tells Darcy, "Well, if you forgive me for saying so, I managed to secure your affection despite dirty boots, petticoats 6 inches deep in mud, wind-blown hair, a singular lack of accomplishments, and a truly regrettable tendency to speak my mind regardless of the consequences." Of course, this line is originally Louisa Hurst's. After Elizabeth walks to Netherfield to tend to Jane when she's sick, Mrs. Hurst says, "I hope you saw her petticoat 6 inches deep in mud, I am absolutely certain, and the gown which had been let down to hide it not doing its office." We have to assume that Mrs. Hurst is kind of maliciously exaggerating here, but even if that description is literally true, how would Elizabeth happen to hit upon the exact same wording that Mrs. Hurst had used? Are we supposed to understand that she hung around after dinner outside the door, eavesdropping on their conversation? And if so, Darcy was there too. He was part of that conversation, so why does he never respond like, "Wait, you heard that?" Or, to return to an earlier example, I mentioned the quotation of "My courage always rises with every attempt to intimidate me in Not Every Gentleman" as a way that Mr. Bennet used to describe Edward. But later in that same fic, Darcy is speaking of Elizabeth protecting him from being expected to dance with young ladies he doesn't know. What horror. And he says that "the danger in the ballroom scared my protector away, and I know her courage rises with every attempt to intimidate her." Okay, so in this universe, where did he get this language from? Are we supposed to understand that Mr. Bennet has said this to him before and then he repeated it? Why does Elizabeth not seem to note the repetition of the phrase or ask, like, "Have you been talking to my father?" In Lorraine's Knights in Black Satin Waistcoats, Mr. Knightley considers that Emma's eye reveals a ready wit. Has he gotten his hands on the charade that Mr. Elton wrote to Harriet? And speaking of Harriet, when she calls herself the natural daughter of nobody knows whom in Ulrica's A Love Most Unwanted, did she somehow hear Mr. Knightley say this? Or, in Lisdy's The Colors of Trope, Mr. Darcy describes himself as a man of sense and education who has lived in the world in a conversation immediately following Elizabeth's rejection of his first proposal. But in the universe of the fic, everything has been canon up until this point. So if Mr. Darcy is quoting what Elizabeth said to him at Rosings, why doesn't he mention it? Or why doesn't she mention it? It doesn't really seem like a self-conscious quotation. I think that this realist mode of understanding language, where we conceive of characters as real actors whose memory and knowledge of language and dialogue is distinct from each other's, is just not the way that we're meant to understand this kind of thing. I think these are the wrong questions to be asking. On some level, when characters are made to make illusions of this sort, they're communicating with us, not with each other. or rather the author of the fic is communicating with an assumed community of readers who are expected to understand the reference. The copied string of language just serves as an index to remind us of a particular scene. Hi, Editing Nigia here. I also wanted to point out that we can contrast this with the situation that existed in the 18th century. Recall the example that we looked at in Charles Grandison, where the fact that Clementina knew a quotation from Hamlet had to be explained by saying both that she had read Hamlet and that she had taken particular notice of that specific line. In JAFF, there's no necessity at all to explain how a character came by a quote, and there's no expectation that it should even be possible for them to have come by the quote. Rather than a realist mode, we could call this a transparent mode of using language, where characters' minds and memories and modes of expression are all sort of permeable to each other. Any character can take over the voice of any other character or any narrator at any time. I'm going to argue that this mode of interaction between author and reader comes to function as a game. And it's a game that can only take place because, as with an 18th century canonical education, there's an assumed common ground. At least many of the people taking part will have read the same texts or perhaps watched the same adaptations. Sometimes an author's note will let readers know that there's a game afoot. For example, in the description of Liz D's The Colors of Trope, the author says that they are playing with Austen's text. The author's note says, "All credit must go to Miss Jane Austen. Control-C, Control-V," which are, of course, the keyboard shortcuts for copy and paste, and all the fiction/fanfiction writers out there tweaking the tropes of romance and fiction to write more stories. If you have read Pride and Prejudice, and if you haven't read it or seen any of the adaptations, why are you here? You will recognize many of the passages contained in this little ditty. I have taken a great deal of license and given them to characters or places as I see fit. Some people tell me I look like Amy Lee. AN, if you don't know who that is, get the hell out of here. So we see the idea of an in-group of people who have the same knowledge and remember the same things being separated from an out-group defined by their lack of knowledge. An author's note to Rachel's The Child of Good Fortune reads, "If some of McCoy's phrases sound familiar to you, then you can congratulate yourself for your excellent memory, because many of these lines were borrowed from Knightley's speech in chapter 49 of Emma." And just one more. About their fic finding him quite the reverse, Ms. Pimpernel writes, "I shamelessly pilfered some of J.A.'s sentences because her words are fun to play with." Smiley face. And another note they say, "I had canon under the eyes when I wrote. I guess you recognized many phrases or tweaked paragraphs. It was really fun to use mostly the same words, but with a different meaning/context." So to the reasons for quoting I mentioned earlier, we can add another, which is that it's just plain fun. It's fun for the author to play with the language, to use skill to determine which quotations can be used and how they should be twisted to fit a certain situation. And it's fun for the reader to have that little thrill of recognition from reading a line that they recognize, or to have the challenge of remembering or tracking down a quotation. And there's also the flattering feeling of being in on a joke. It reminds me of something that E.E. Kellett says about literary quotation. "There may, it is true, be a little vanity mingled with this pleasure. The reader may, overtly or subconsciously, be pluming himself on his knowledge and detective acumen. But that is all to the advantage of the author. It helps to create a sympathy between him and the reader. You," the writer says in effect, "are a person of culture, and while I should not venture to set such a puzzle to others, I am sure that you will be able to solve it." Commenters often point out where an author has used a quote to indicate that they picked up on the game or that they won. For example, a commenter on Bethany Dellman's crossover fanfiction Fall on the Sword copies out the author's sentence, "It is too much to remember at 22 all the foolish things that were done in one's youth," and calls it very clever, presumably to signal that they understood the reference to Pride and Prejudice. Bingley had said, "This is too much to remember at night, all the foolish things that were said in the morning." Or on Chocolate is My Drug's Emma fic, The Root of His Troubles, someone commented, "Buzzer sounds or maybe a whistle. Persuasion reference alert. No one so capable, so responsible." Buzzer. I love that. That's so funny. And commenters don't have to limit themselves to finding the author's Easter eggs. They can reference some of their own. I found this to be especially frequent in the Emma fandom over on fanfiction.net. There's a million examples, but I'll just give a couple. Chocolate is My Drug leaves a comment on Katzon's fic Sojourn at Dunwell, saying that a scenario in the fic would have given Mr. Knightley the idea of him and Emma as a couple. And of course, a mind such as his, once opening to suspicion, would make rapid progress. The slight misquotation of "such as" for "like" makes me suspect that this was quoted from memory. Or V22's modern Emma AU symmetry ends with Knightley proposing to Emma, and instead of her answer, the author just gives us the Austen quote, "What did she say? Just what she ought, of course. A lady always does." A commenter copied the style of this rather than merely responding to it, and said, "I've been alternately dreading and longing for this," meaning the last chapter of the fic, "ever since I read the prologue, and feel like Lizzie when she wished, she feared, and whether she wished or feared it most, she could scarcely determine. And then, though but a moment before she had believed her wishes to predominate, she began to regret that it came." This is just to show you that I loved this epilogue more because of the Austen quote at the end, :D. And the author's note for one chapter of their fic, Mr. Knightley's Ward, author Emerson echoes Mr. Knightley's declaration to Emma, "My dearest reader, for dearest you will always be. I cannot make speeches, reader. If I loved you less, I might be able to post the first draft and call it a day. But you know what I am. You will read nothing but truth from me. I have abandoned you and forced you to wait months on end, and you have borne it as no other reader on this site would have borne it." And it goes on in the same style. A commenter then responds, "My dearest writer, for dearest you will always be. Writing in a fandom as small as Emma, where too few readers read and comment, I have not abandoned you. Though I may not always review, I do read that which you write, even if I have to wait months on end." So we can see that quotation serves as an area of back and forth between the author and the commenter, an aspect of common ground that can be taken advantage of as a site for mutual play. Playing high. Parody, puns, satire, and clever twists on known wording have roots in the fertile ground of quotation, mimicking and echoing established texts in amusing, sometimes devastating, ways. The very word allusion derives from the Latin alludere, to mock, play with, suggestive of its ludic, game-like dimension. Ruth Finnegan. You know I've been going on for too long when I'm losing the light. Let's wrap it up. Well, if this is a game, what are the stakes of it? Is it possible to fail at it? And are there people who are more skilled at it than others? What can we tell about how the game is evaluated from reading conversations in the comments? A commenter on Rusako's Playing Their Cards Right, which if you remember is one of those that quotes a passage at the beginning and then it veers off into the fic writer's texts. The commenter says, "Oh, I absolutely loved it. Your transition from the canon, the advantages of writing in a public domain fandom, was smooth and flawless." Other commenters mention catching Austen's tone, capturing the way the conversation might go. We get the sense that the skill is felt to be in the resemblance of the pastiche to Austen's prose, such that the boundaries between Austen's language and the fic author's language are not jarring. To look at another comment, Elizabeth's Contradictions and Varieties is a slight AU where Lady Catherine does not make her appearance towards the end of Pride and Prejudice. So Elizabeth and Darcy have most of their "I can no longer help thanking you for your unexampled kindness to my poor sister" conversation, with added thoughts and reactions interspersed with the dialogue. But then that conversation veers off course, since Darcy doesn't propose again until later. There are a couple other quotations in the fic as well. The description of Jane that she is very firm where she feels herself to be right is given to Darcy in his dialogue. Elizabeth says that it's an excellent description of her, which might remind us of the fact that it was originally narratorial description, which is either the narrator's voice or perhaps Elizabeth's. A comment on that same fic contains the compliment, "You've woven Austen's words from the original scenario in so elegantly." So unlike in the previous example where we had a block quote and then a transition to the fic writer's text, the metaphor of weaving here reflects the cutting in and out of Austen's voice. And actually in comments about this kind of quotation, that same metaphor of something being woven or of weaving comes up repeatedly. But here, you've woven them in so elegantly. I think that the word elegantly implies something similar to the previous compliment, that same kind of smoothness, the lack of an unintentional jarring difference in tone or style. To get at when readers of fanfiction judge the incorporation of quotations to be done unskillfully, I suspect a survey would be helpful. People are more willing to be complimentary than to be very critical, like directly in someone's comments. But I did come across a couple of criticisms of quote incorporation. In Secrets and Strawberries, Chocolate is My Drug reassigns Emma's Box Hill insult to instead be uttered by Mrs. Elton. Emma is then horrified not only at Mrs. Elton's unpardonable rudeness, but at the sudden realization that what Mrs. Elton had said aloud was just like many other scornful, ungracious thoughts she herself had had in the past concerning Miss Bates. It was dreadful to think that she was really no better than Mrs. Elton. A reviewer replies to this chapter, "It seems a bit over the top to have Mrs. Elton say precisely as Emma did in the original novel." The same reviewer goes on to respond positively to some references to Pride and Prejudice in another chapter of the same fic, so it's probably not the concept of quoting itself that they object to. Maybe it's something about Emma's "you'll be limited as to number, only 3 at a time" insult is just too distinctive to pass off to anyone else. I found one other criticism of quote incorporation, and this one is on the level of realism. Three Tuxedo Cats fic Never a Crossword reverses the path that Elizabeth's initial impressions of Mr. Darcy take. She tours Pemberley and hears Mrs. Reynolds' praise of him and begins to fantasize about him as this ideal man before she meets him in Meryton and has her opinion of him slowly become more negative. A comment on the first chapter reads, "While an interesting idea, I don't think it really works having the text from the book on Elizabeth's thoughts on Darcy. It worked in the book for her to have those thoughts, but for Elizabeth to be obsessing over him and being completely distracted over someone she's never met and has only seen a portrait and the housekeeper's opinion is frankly bizarre." So for this reader, the change in context, namely the fact that Elizabeth has never met Darcy before, makes it make less sense than it does in canon for her to be so interested in what Mrs. Reynolds has to say about him. But then again, some later comments disagree. One calls the fic entirely realistic and in character. Another says, "I really enjoyed the passages from the book and thought they worked. Who wouldn't feel like that when Mr. Darcy was described and depicted to them like that?" And another says, "To me, it seems very in character for Lizzie to quickly form an opinion about someone, so why not with someone she's never met?" So all these commenters seem to agree about what you have to do to succeed or to fail at quote incorporation. The incorporation of a quote should describe something that we can imagine happening based on the fic writer's imagined scenario and based on what we understand the characters to be like. That's when a quotation works. They just disagree about whether the ones in the fic do in fact work. Interestingly, though, that perception is not universal. Someone else said, "I appreciate that for some readers your take here on Lizzie's thoughts about Darcy seems out of character. But for me, I think that's the point of fan fiction. It doesn't have to make perfect sense or be completely in line with canon." So we have this idea that text can be reappropriated and incorporated in different places freely, that it doesn't necessarily need to be bound by a sense of realism. In JoJo 4's author's note, which I mentioned earlier, they say that they have lifted a shameful bit of Austen's text, but their story is not merely a copy. They added more while trying not to diverge too far from Austen's voice. I think there's a bit of playful false modesty in the word shameful, because they go on to defend themselves from a potential accusation of unoriginality, as if to say, "I have the right to use this text because I've added to it. I've created something new enough to be worth reading, even for the person who has already read Austen's Emma." So we might add that to be successful, a usage of quotation has to be interesting. You have to change or add something about it to prevent your readers from skimming past it. But there's a balancing act because you should still be writing something close to what Austen would have or could have written. That kind of playful false modesty that I read into the tone there gets at something else that I want to talk about, which is how this culture of quotation reveals various attitudes towards Austen herself. The dominant attitude towards Jane Austen's prose in the author's notes of fic writers is like exaggerated, worshipful humility, which is really interesting, and it's kind of dual-edged, because on the one hand, it does seem very humble to say something like, "Here I provide for you in italics Miss Austen's own dialogue upon which I would never presume I could improve." But on the other hand, if Austen is so masterful and so without parallel, then that just increases the audacity of presuming to rearrange and repurpose and play with her language. Come in, come in. Hi.
You look hot.
Thank you. Okay. We're elegant ladies here. A joke about this kind of thing is in the author's note to D. Lyme's Uncommonly Intelligent, which is a variation wherein Elizabeth Bennet is the smartest person in England. They write, "There are a few lines in the middle of this chapter that are taken almost verbatim from the original as an homage to Miss Austen. They don't quite fit seamlessly with my own writing style, but they are too iconic to change, and I suppose she did her best." Which, if you can joke about this kind of thing, that suggests to me that it is like a norm in the community, that it's so frequently repeated that people have started to kind of riff on it. This kind of ambivalent attitude is also captured really well in an author's note to Pterodactyls Trying to Tread Water. I've thrown in a slight dig at the then Prince of Wales because it's what Jane Austen would have wanted, and a tone shift in some lines from the book which maybe she would not have wanted. But I thought it was interesting to apply different emotions and circumstances to some of my favorite dialogue and see how it changes it. So that's the change of situation mode that I was talking about earlier. But the ambivalence I'm talking about is that we can ignore what we presume Austen would have wanted in order to interest and entertain ourselves, but we still have to make a point of bringing up what we think Austen would have wanted. Or we could consider it in reverse. We're bringing up what we assume Austen would have wanted in order to emphasize our own audacity in defying it. So those two impulses, some fandom scholars might say affirmation versus transformation, are really closely entangled here. Earlier, I mentioned Russako's Playing Their Cards Right, which is an AU take on the Elizabeth serving coffee scene towards the end of Pride and Prejudice. That fic was itself inspired by Cattry's yielding to persuasion. And I want to talk about yielding to persuasion here because not only does it also open with a sustained quotation from that same scene and then continue to quote Austen throughout the rest of the fic, but it was also written as a game. It was written in fulfillment of one of the prompts given for a game of trope inversion bingo. The prompt being, the main couple has a misunderstanding that could easily be resolved by talking about it. They talk about it. So by beginning their fics at this point in time, by choosing a scene in an Austen novel to subvert and to diverge from, Cattry and Russako irreverently bring Jane Austen into the game. The game was probably intended to subvert tropes commonly used by fic writers, but it becomes their way of subverting the usage of a similar trope by Austen herself. They make Austen the target of the good-natured raillery that the game directs at the fandom. Here's how Cattry manages this scene. We get this quote, "The gentleman came, and she thought he looked as if he would have answered her hopes. But alas, the ladies had crowded round the table where Miss Bennet was making tea, and Elizabeth pouring out the coffee, and so close a confederacy that there was not a single vacancy near her which would admit of a chair. And on the gentleman's approaching, one of the girls moved closer to her than ever, and said in a whisper, 'The men shan't come and part us, I am determined.' 'Speak for yourself,' Elizabeth said. 'We want none of them, do we?' 'All right, I am now done pouring coffee,' Elizabeth said. 'It only took a minute or so, and we are all adults here. I am sure anyone who wants milk or sugar can get it themselves. Excuse me, but I need to speak to Mr. Darcy now.'" So here we can see that there is, in fact, a very sharp break in tone where Austen's voice leaves off and Cattry's voice comes in. In all honesty, I do have to say that can happen a lot when fic writers quote Austen because their style or the quality of their prose is just so different from hers. But in this case, the sudden change is clearly actually intentional. The introduction of this casual tone and the sparser punctuation lets us know, okay, we're having some fun now. And I think that this kind of thing is where we get the closest to doing something like what Austen does in using quotation to mock the tropes surrounding quotation. If, as I said earlier, it is a norm in the fandom that in using Austen quotation you should try to make it as seamless as possible, then it suggests that is in fact a norm if you can subvert it and thereby have people understand that you are making a joke. So just like how by the end of the 18th century, the rules surrounding quotation had become played out enough times that they could be referenced and exaggerated and mocked, maybe the uses to which quotation is put in JAFF have become organized enough over the past couple decades that we can make this kind of second-order joke about them. The conclusion of the play. Of course, it is difficult to draw generalizations across such a large corpus composed of works written by so many different authors, but these examples will hopefully at least illustrate that this kind of textual play is possible and recurrent and understood and encouraged and engaged in by readers and commenters. These modes of repurposing text are popular in fandom spaces characterized by writers and readers who read each other's texts, writers and readers who have presumably read a good deal of works within the corpus and are familiar with its rules and its tropes. This says something about fan fiction and fan culture as a space that can create and enforce its own tropes and its own norms. So we're talking not just about individual fanfics as literary objects that use specific techniques to produce an effect, although that is part of what I've mentioned. But we're also, on the other hand, we're talking about fandom broadly as a culture and considering that culture in like network or ethnological terms. The lens of quotation allows us to combine both of those two approaches really well because, of course, a quotation is made up of words, but quotation also always has an element of culture in it. If you reference something, cultural concerns are going to determine whether your audience understands the reference and how they interpret it. So, where do we go from here? Well, we might consider, instead of quotations from Austen, quotations that originate in JAFF spaces, like all of the Pride and Prejudice fics that call Caroline and Louisa Bingley the superior sisters, or matchmaking mamas is also a phrase that I see repeated again and again. We might also consider the usage of quotations in other fan works as opposed to just fan fiction, like graphics, GIF sets, and merch. You see a lot of quotes and speeches from silly characters that are derided in the original work, but they're presented in fan art kind of like they're serious, like Caroline Bingley's, "I declare after all there is no enjoyment like reading," or Mrs. Elton's, "Without music life would be a blank to me." And I am just dying to know whether these artists are making a joke or whether they're in earnest. Another thing I didn't talk about is the usage of language from adaptations. We can't assume that everyone who reads and writes JAFF has read the source material. There might be situations where people work backwards. They might see an adaptation or read fan fiction and then go back and look for those quotations in Austen. So the recognition that I talked about can perhaps also work in reverse. And lastly, we might consider the difference in culture between different fan fiction sites and different time periods, which is something that I didn't really get into. I just pulled indiscriminately from various fanfic sites. But given the different rules and regulations that different fic sites have, it's totally possible to think that their approach to Austen's language would be very different. Well, that's it for me. If you've stuck around to this point, thank you so much. I have not lived up to the adage that if one loves something, one ought to talk about it less, but I hope at least I have entertained.